Our next panel discussion, as I mentioned earlier, will focus on the energy transition. How the UK can comply with the Paris Agreement in the face of our current political outlooks and pressure generated by the invasion of Ukraine. This session will be chaired by Professor Ioannis Ioannou. I hope I pronounced it properly.
Perfect.
Ioannis is a leading strategy scholar whose research focuses on sustainability and corporate social responsibility. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ioannis.
Wonderful. So good afternoon, everybody. It's really a pleasure and a privilege to be here with you. And since I am at London Business School and we did buy this building, I would like to welcome you on behalf of London Business School as well on the important conference that you have today. The energy transition, an absolutely fundamental issue. There is no discussion going to a low carbon or a zero carbon economy without really understanding how on earth are we going to transition the energy system. Clearly, not only in terms of energy generation, but also distribution and also storage, a number of challenges that probably you guys know better than I do. Now, this is an industry that for years was depending on things like regulation, subsidies, and so on, but there's no question that in more recent years has become a lot more cost effective to move to renewables as opposed to fossil fuels. But it's not only the economic aspect, of course. There are technical and technological challenges to the energy transition, and there's also social challenges to the energy transition. And how fitting, of course, that we're having this discussion while COP27 is taking place. Since we are in the UK, one ought to mention that we have been making progress in this country, probably despite the government rather than in front of the government, because of the government. As you know, we're going through our third prime minister for this year, who was shamed into showing up at COP27 and with a bit of audacity kind of said, we want to turn the UK into a clean energy superpower, assuming that he makes it until Christmas. Anyway, so a lot of political challenges, in other words, to discuss here. But for the rest of the hour, so that we have together, I'll be nothing less than the glorious timekeeper for these wonderful people and deeply knowledgeable people that we have on the panel today. So the way we're going to run this, we're going to have three opening remarks, three talks by the esteemed panel, which will be about 10-15 minutes each. And then we're going to have hopefully about 20 to 30 minutes of a discussion between us. So first, allow me to introduce Erik. Erik is a physicist and petroleum engineer, as well as a climate change activist, sustainability engineer, and an avid ocean sailor. He has worked on technical and integrated petroleum developments, carbon capture and storage, energy and sustainability analysis and implementation, and on climate change awareness as a co-founder of Aberdeen Climate Action. So Erik has a deep understanding of the role of hydrogen in both transition and greenwash, and is currently looking to introduce a proven industrial approach to scale up home decarbonization in Scotland and the UK with his venture Transition Catalyst. As you know, the whole issue of the building and construction in the UK and retrofitting our buildings that are a major source of carbon emissions is quite a big challenge. So as a Dutch national living in the European oil center of Aberdeen, he's intimately familiar with the oil and gas industry, so he hates them from within, from which he learned to use integrated solutions. That was not in his bio, by the way, that was just in case. Okay. Integrated solutions to complex challenges, and it's precisely this combination of holistic perspective and detailed understanding which helps him see the critical failings of our current ineffective approach. Erik, without any further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yeah, if you can start the... No.
I hope the UK government didn't sabotage us.
There we go.
Okay.
Good. That's actually a more real issue than you think, being sabotaged by people who are not supposed to be listening. What I'm going to do in the next 15 minutes is give you a quick rush through a number of aspects of the energy system and the way we look at it, and a slightly different way in which it's more helpful to look at it, and about the energy and the transition. I won't be able to cover everything in detail. If there's any questions remaining, please keep them for the discussion afterwards, because there will be time there to touch on these things. And I hope, if it all goes well, that the question, any role for oil and gas, that you'll be able to answer that after the talk. This is the content of the talk. So really short bits from greenhouse gas emissions and the carbon budget, just to make sure we're all on the same path. Energy and electricity and how they tie together. A little intermezzo demonstrating that change is possible, as we've heard also this morning or earlier from Mary Robinson. She used the moon landing example. I've got a few others. And then the core of it is I'm going to go into energy and supply and demand, and I'm going to look at it in a slightly different way from the normal conversation we have. And then a few other bits, including just transition and what it is. So greenhouse gas and the carbon budget. This you might be familiar with. This is the global emissions. Sorry. Closer, like this. Is that better? Okay, I do apologize. And I'll try to slow down a bit too. This curve is the global carbon emissions, and the little yellow bit was my prediction, and that actually proved this week to be the actual emissions. The global emissions proven last year to be higher than ever before. So there are 2 points of interest. One of them is now, which is at the end, and one of them is in about 1985, 1987, which is when the world was aware of the risk of climate change. And when I say aware, this was not just when the IPCC came up, but when even Margaret Thatcher made it explicitly clear to the UN that climate change was something to be dealt with. This was then the carbon budget, and this is why it was then supposed to be a transition, because if we started reducing our emissions, then we would have until well into the next century to do that. We had over a century and a half to do that. Now, in the meantime, what we've been doing is this. And we've been accelerating our emissions as opposed to the opposite. And now we're at the top, and it's more than ever. And what that means is that our remaining carbon budget, which lasted until 2150, now runs out by 2050. Yeah, so we just lost 100 years by not doing anything over the last 30 years. And since I made this graph a year and a half ago, this is what we've done. And therefore, these are the extra emissions we've committed to. And this is the bit of the carbon budget that we've destroyed in the last couple of years. So to emphasize that point, whereas in the 1980s and the 1990s, we could talk about a transition. Now we really need a transformation. We need big change. We need to go in a completely different direction. Okay, before I start talking about energy, I just want to align a few things. Climate change, the greenhouse gas emissions that cause it, are caused for 80 to 90% by the burning of fossil fuels. Yeah, there's no uncertainty about where the problem comes from. And we currently burn a lot of fossil fuels for energy. But it's important to realize that energy is not fossil fuel, and we'll come to that later. Energy is something completely separate. So this is a nice plot. This is how we think it's going, because this is the one that always makes it to the press. This is our electricity network. And this is just a straight line extrapolation, fossil fuels and renewables. And you can see that for the critical decade, which is when we really need to reduce our emissions to half between now and 2030, we're doing quite well. We're making it to 50% fossil fuels. And that's why this is published a lot, because we like happy news. And this is, I kind of differentiate real news from happy news. This is happy news. This is the UK energy use and how it's actually going. And you see the renewables are only a very small part still. And if you extrapolate that, then you end up with a substantial amount of fossil fuels by 2045, 2050. And this is really worrying, because this is incompatible with our promises to relating to the Paris Agreement, and it's incompatible with a livable world. This is what the fossil fuel curve must do. And you can either look at filling in that gap with renewables, which is why the government and the fossil fuel industry all say, oh, but you cannot grow renewables fast enough, and therefore you need more fossil fuels in the future. But you can also reduce the wastage. And this is something that Rufus will touch upon later. Home retrofit, transport changes. There are a lot of ways in which you can quickly reduce the total amount of energy. And then you see that the growth curve of renewables is fully achievable. In fact, it's only slightly faster than what we've done till now. Just a little intermezzo on change. And it's important to realize, and as someone who spends quite a lot of time on this frustrating fight against climate change and every year sees that it gets worse and worse, that big change is possible as long as there is the desire to do so. And Mary Robinson mentioned an example this morning of the moon landings, which took 8 years from the commitment to go there to actually being there, and that was considered unachievable. What we're looking at with decarbonization is fully achievable. There are pathways, there are project plans, there are ways to do it, but we just haven't committed to it yet. But an example I like to use is the USA in World War II, where they completely stopped commercial car and truck manufacturing just over a month after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and they didn't start it up until 1945, the end of 1945 again. And they completely converted to the making of military equipment, including planes and tanks, stuff that they'd never built before. And the way they did that included the Automotive Council, which is a collaboration between all the car manufacturers to share technology about how to do this. There are other examples about the Netherlands gas grid, the internet, mobile phones, things you will be familiar with. The mobile phones one is an interesting one because it involves a lot of infrastructure. And that has grown tremendously quickly. A lot of investment, a lot of infrastructure, and therefore is a valuable example for some of these things. But now to the core, what is it with energy? And when you hear the discussion about energy, it's all about supply and demand. And in my network, which is about 50% oil people and 50% climate activists, the oil people typically say, well, you know, you have to reduce the demands because we just supply what people want. And that is also the general conversation of the government, who, of course, has main advisors, and all their main advisors have links to the fossil fuel industry, which they call the energy industry. This is supply and demand, where you have a market, where you have on offer electricity, solid fuels, liquid fuels, gas, and you have a market that buys exactly the same stuff. So they have to match. And this is the market. But to actually understand what's going on with energy, there's a few things that change this picture. Now, the historical availability influences demand. What that means is that if you can cheaply get coal, you will want coal. If you can easily get gas, you will want gas. With the same reason, if you had access to a heat pump cheaply 10 or 15 years ago, you would have installed that heat pump. And that's the thing to keep in mind, that this demand and supply curve is based on what went before. The other thing is marketing and targeted uses influence demand. And the marketing, that's pretty clear. Marketing gets forgotten, but there's been really, really hard marketing for decades, if not for nearly a century, to increase fossil fuel sales. But the targeted uses is things like vehicles. Yeah, cars run on liquid fuels. That determines the demand of liquid fuels. If you would start making cars that don't use liquid fuels but something else, you would change the demand picture. And then the third point, and that's really important, this supply and demand isn't where the emissions problem lies. You need to look one level deeper at the source. That is, where does this supply come from? And that is quite clearly, it's renewables, nuclear, and fossil fuels. And the emissions problem lies in the source. It lies in the fossil fuels. The other side of the scale, you also need to look a bit further, because we don't need fossil fuels or liquid fuels or gas or electricity. We typically need heat and power. And however you get that, that is determined by the complexity of the market, as the economists call it. That is how we ended up with what we have now, but that is also how we can end up with something else. And interestingly, the market is really quite good at resolving these kind of things. If you have clarity on the need and you have clarity on the source where it needs to come from, then that will come around. But to make that work, you need a regulatory framework to make sure you end up with what you want. And that is the government. The government sets the regulatory framework, and they need to make it clear that the path ahead is the one without fossil fuels. That's not what the UK government is doing, and it's not what a lot of governments are doing either. They are facilitating the fossil fuel industry to keep on producing fossil fuels for longer. That is a specific intention, which they don't pronounce that way, but that is the big projects are on carbon storage. And carbon storage, don't get me wrong, is interesting, but it can only work for a small part of the UK's industrial emissions. And if you think that's a lot, the UK industrial emissions are only 2% of the total UK emissions. So all of these billions, which the government has invested in carbon storage, go for a fraction of the 2%. But that's not what they're used for. They're used for making sure that the fossil fuel industry has something in the future which doesn't say, we need to get rid of you guys. The government also supports hydrogen, similar stage. I'm not saying hydrogen itself isn't bad. Hydrogen isn't the solution that the government pretends it is. There are solutions available. So to make the step from heat and power to renewables and nuclear, and you'll see I've made the fossil fuels here quite small because that's the regulatory change which is needed. There are lots of ways to reduce these, and later Rufus will cover on retrofit and how you can, in the UK, take 30 to 40% off the total emissions of the UK with a good retrofit coverage. Transport, similarly, changing the transport system to get people out of individual cars and into functioning public transport will make a huge impact on the total emissions, far bigger than the additional gas exploration and production that the government has committed to, even though that infrastructure will be around and producing fossil fuels for 30 to 40 years, because that is the timeline of fossil fuels infrastructure. So quickly, what is necessary is to regulate. The first, it has to be clear that fossil fuels are removed as an energy source, to send a clear market signal where this whole complexity has to go. And then the next thing is to reduce wastage and reduce energy usage, which can be done. And just to give you an idea on energy wastage, when you use electricity for power in a motor, electricity is about 80% efficient. If you use petrol, diesel, or gas in that same motor, you will never, it's physically impossible to be more than 40% efficient. So you're already burning more than half of your energy without any benefit from it. So the change from fossil fuels to other sources will actually come with a step change in efficiency, and that will automatically bring the energy demand down. There we go. And then the next point is the two tools the government has are stimulus and taxation, to stimulate the new market setting. And what the government is doing, of course, is stimulating the old market setting, the old energy providers, which are the fossil fuel industry. And then the third thing the government can do is tax, and that needs to be focused on the old emissions-based market. And specifically, I was asked recently in a LinkedIn conversation by someone who said, oh, but how far do you want to tax the oil industry then? And I said, well, you want to tax the oil industry to the hilt until they die, because that's the whole purpose of the exercise. But if you make them die slowly, you get less disruption and you get more money out of it to finance the change. But in the end, you have to tax them until they die. That's the whole purpose of the exercise. And just a few words on just transition before I'll round up. What is not And the word just transition has been hijacked already. It's a really valuable term, but a lot of it's been hijacked by government together with energy industry to mean the transition of energy companies. And that's not what it's about. The current energy companies, the fossil fuel companies, are in the wrong business. That is going out of business. And they have two choices in the economics context. They can either give the money back to the shareholders, or they can go into a new business that their shareholders approve of, and they can buy into that. But it's only what you do with the money. There are no spare skills. There's no spare intention. There's no necessity to keep on going. And the other thing is, it's also not about those few jobs in the oil industry and the numbers around that, and I have backup slides for that if you're interested. The actual numbers of people directly employed in the oil industry are tiny. And you're looking at less than 0.5% of the total UK workforce. You're looking slightly over 1% of the Scottish workforce. And that is all. And I'm not saying they should be forgotten. No, but they are not the problem, because the transition or the transformation will create far more jobs than this handful of them. But it is about transformation of everything. And on that note, I think my time is up. So I'll leave it at that and pass on to the next speaker.
Wonderful. Thank you, Erik. Quite optimistic there about the role of the government, especially the ones that are bought out by fossil fuel companies, but we can discuss that. Wonderful. So our second panelist and second speaker for today is Rufus. So after 20 plus years in finance and as an entrepreneur, Rufus pivoted his career to focus exclusively on the sustainability transition in 2019 to repent for his prior sins. That's also not in his bio. Now, so it's fair, I know. He's global head of retrofit and built environment and head of UK and Ireland at not-for-profit sustainable finance advisory firm called BWB, where he advises foundations, corporates, NGOs, local and national government bodies on how to fund net zero carbon strategies, as well as deliver improved social outcomes. The core of this work has been on developing an innovative place-based funding and implementation approach to decarbonizing the built environment at neighborhood and ultimately national scale, funded by pension funds. In addition, Rufus is a co-founder of fintech startup, Metal Capital, an ESG data business that delivers intuitive visual representations of the evolving ESG risks for companies to reveal materiality and performance in the components of sustainability. So he's a busy man. I'm still reading on his bio. He cracked the code of 36 hours in a day. This is a company that he's very tired. That's water. Aiding investors, insurers, corporates, and advisors to integrate relevant ESG information into the decision-making. He also sits on the ESG advisory board of Mears Group PLC, which maintains and manages housing in the UK. Finally, he has had an interest in the hospitality industry since 2006 as a venue operator and advisor to drinks companies. What kind of drinks? No. Oh, wonderful. Rufus is married with 3 teenage children and 2 dogs and lives in Kent. When not working, he's keen baker, cyclist, and runner, the latter 2 partly offsetting the former. That's not my judgment, that's also in the bio. Rufus, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Brilliant, thank you. Have I got the mic positioning right? Can you hear me? Is that right? Good, okay. So I'm going to talk about retrofit. This might get a little bit nerdy, but you have to, if you're going to fix these things. Should I stop moving? The camera's following me. So let's just frame retrofit. There are 28 million homes in the UK. I'm going to use UK as an example, but you could equally apply this to any other country. 28 million homes, roughly 20 to 25% of UK emissions. It's actually going up as a percentage because it's one of the most stubborn sectors in terms of reducing over the last couple of decades. If you add in the 2 to 3 million commercial properties, you get to 35% of emissions. So it's a very significant component. what we've been trying to look at is to develop a model to fund and implement retrofit at scale at an overall community level, at a neighborhood, sort of street by street level. We're working with an organization called 3CI, or the Cities Commission for Climate Investment. It represents 60 to 70 now UK cities, regions, and county councils, and is growing rapidly. And we've been working funded from BEIS, the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, to scope out how we might take these ideas forward. We're bankers. BWB stands for Bankers Without Boundaries, kind of Médecins Sans Frontières, kind of, but with finance. We kind of look at what's the economic model of this stuff, how do we fix it? So I'm going to start with why it's incredibly hard to fix, and then I'll kind of look at how it looks economically and therefore how you can fix it. I'm not going to go through all of these, but there are lots of reasons it's difficult. Very expensive. So estimates for how much it costs per property range from £10,000 per property to about 70. Huge range, huge disagreement. If you take the midpoint, that's £1 trillion problem for the UK. So a significant amount of money needs to be spent on buildings to decarbonize them. As I'll show, the returns are good or bad, depending on your point of view and depending on your timeline. But there are lots of issues, principal agent issues. If you're a landlord and you decarbonize your property, your resident gets lower energy bills, you get no financial return from doing that. So there's immediately a disincentive to do it. I'm also going to touch on the regressive impact. So the cost of decarbonizing a property per square meter is roughly the same wherever you look in the country. So if you have a 90 square meter house, which is the UK average, in Greenock, the most deprived area of the UK, it will cost you the same amount if you have a similar sized house in, I don't know, Greenwich, to pick somewhere closer to where we are now. Obviously, the asset price, the house price, and the income of the resident are very, very different between those two places. And so if you go down a route, which is how we are currently progressing, and we're not alone in that, of essentially working our way to forcing people to do this, it's incredibly regressive. Because you're essentially forcing a flat tax on the whole population. Okay, so to get into the economics of this, there is a cost to doing this. The cost is roughly a 40-40-20 split in 3 different buckets. So at the bottom, you've got demand reduction, that's your insulation. That's reducing the amount of heat you have to put into a property to keep it at a comfortable level, so stopping that heat escaping. There's then decarbonizing heat generation. So that could be a heat pump, for example, could be district heating. As Erik sort of alluded to, I don't think it's hydrogen, but that's a separate topic. And then the third and smallest piece, but really important, as we'll see later, is distributed energy generation. So solar panels, batteries, most likely on the property. When you do that, you reduce your energy bill. And if you take an economic valuation view of that, that's an annuity saving. So every year you're saving money, and over time that income stream or saving stream has a value. And as you can see, it's potentially quite significant if you look at that forever. It's not enough in terms of value terms to pay back the cost, but we have this as well. So housing, poor quality housing, particularly damp, but lots of other issues are hugely linked to bad healthcare outcomes. If you have bad healthcare outcomes, you have low productivity, and you have the requirement to have a health service to fix those healthcare problems, which costs us lots of money. So there are lots of other benefits as well from improving the quality of housing. I think there is a case that actually we should just raise a £1 trillion green gilt and pay for this, that the return to society is positive. Back in the real world, that's unlikely to happen. So we have to think about private finance. So if we go back to the starting point of the cost, the vast majority of thinking in this space thinks about retail finance. So you get all these kind of comments at conferences about we need to mobilize private finance. And everyone sort of claps and says, what a great idea. But it never goes beyond that in terms of detail. And private finance is an incredibly varied thing. And typically in this space, you have a lot of conversation around green mortgages and a lot of focus on the able to pay market. Now, the able to pay market is shrinking rapidly as mortgage rates go up and as cost of living goes up, and is relatively small anyway. A third of the UK lives either in social housing or private rental. Of the 2/3 that owner occupy, you've got a group at one end who can't raise more money because they have a high loan to value, maybe bought fairly recently. And at the other end of the scale, you have a third of owner-occupiers who are over 65, don't have access to mortgage finance. And then you're looking at the slightly troubling equity release market, which has its own issues. And a lot of people just can't afford to raise more debt. There was I'm being generous here. There was a piece of research done recently that said the average UK homeowner is willing to invest up to £4,000 in their property as long as they get that back over 3 to 4 years. Unfortunately, the green one is about £40,000, and you need about a 30 to 40 year investment payback period to make the numbers add up. So if you go down the route of trying to convince individuals to do this, because they have a very short time period, the average UK homeowner is 56. So a relatively short time period to get the money back, the value of those energy savings are quite low. And that means the amount of private finance you can push through the mortgage system is quite low, which means you need a huge public subsidy. And therefore, your overall return picture, there you go, is poor. The whole thing is undermined in terms of the returns. So what we've been looking at is, could you do this at a bigger scale and bring a different type of private finance in? And we're talking about institutional capital. I imagine most people in the room have got a pension. There is £2.4 trillion sitting in the UK pension fund industry that is desperate to engage with this, this transition, but doesn't have the ability to invest. And one of the key problems is, if you run a £70 billion pension fund, you can't think about a £40,000 investment in number 63. It's too small. So you need to aggregate. So we've been looking at a neighborhood approach to try and create that scale to start to get up to the kind of tens of millions scale that you can have a conversation with an Aviva or a Legal & General or one of those kind of organizations. So back to our cost. If you do that, the pension funds will be prepared to invest for 30 to 40 years. Now that means the value of those savings are much greater. Which means your ability to raise private finance is again much greater. I made that a bit smaller because they do want a return, a relatively low return, but they do want a return. Given that's our collective pension funds, that's probably not a bad thing. Now, which that means therefore you need a much lower public subsidy. Now you still get your environmental benefits. You've now got really quite a nice investment case for doing this. There's a whole much lower burden on Treasury to pay for it. There's another advantage. If you take 1,000 homes in a group of streets and you plan an energy transition for that entire place in a systemic way, and then you deliver it, it's a lot cheaper. You're buying 1,000 heat pumps, not one. A large part of the cost of a heat pump is actually the sales cost of them knocking on the door and convincing you through various cups of tea that you want a heat pump. If you take that out, the cost comes down. We think we're modeling about a 20% reduction in cost. I think it's a lot bigger than that, but there's very little evidence of that at the moment. But your costs go down, and that means your subsidy gets even smaller. But there's something else you can do. And this talks to one of the real key issues, which is, I'm sure this won't be relevant for the people necessarily in this room, but most people do not want to have a retrofit. It involves dust, dirt, your windows being taken out, insulation being put in. It's pretty disruptive. So you need to find a way to create a better narrative around actually doing this. And one of the things you can do, if you imagine planning out the retrofit of an entire neighborhood, and you've got an army of people from and around that community working in that community to deliver this change, you could do other stuff as well. And so we talk about adding an additional bit of cost for regeneration. So that could be tree planting, green infrastructure. It could be mobility infrastructure, EV charging, infrastructure that would support active travel, like secure bike storage. It could be community infrastructure, co-working spaces, repair, reuse cafes, things that change the nature of living in that place and allows you to build a narrative around this for community engagement around regeneration, rather than talking about heat pumps and kilowatt hours and thermal efficiency and all that sort of stuff, which isn't the most exciting conversation. And also that conversation also talks of something you're giving up as opposed to something you're gaining. Now that does mean you do need a bigger public subsidy, but it also means those broader benefits become much bigger because you're really investing in those communities. So that's the economics of it. That's the reason why we think we need to be looking at a much bigger scale. There are, we think, three sources of funding for this. There's the government. Haven't got that much money at the moment, it turns out, but there's the government. There's the private sector, which we talked about. Now, you cannot get this fully commercially viable. Just the numbers don't add up. So you do need grant funding. Where we think is really interesting is the middle box on the left, called outcome buying capital. So this is money that looks like a grant from a funding perspective. Someone gives you some money, you don't have to pay it back, but you do have to deliver an outcome for them. And there's lots of different things that could be. It could be a carbon credit. So someone is buying a carbon credit that's coming out of this. It could be a net biodiversity gain credit. It could be a water company putting money in because the trees that are planted reduce the water runoff into their infrastructure and reduce their costs. It could be a mortgage provider because you do this work, the EPC profile, energy performance certificate profile of their mortgage book gets better, which they're under regulatory pressure to do. It could be the local electricity network operator because you're putting distributed renewable generation into communities, which means the amount of energy they're drawing from the grid goes down and the amount of network reinforcement cost that they have to spend also goes down. So it's about avoided costs. The only other one thing I'll point out here is the top box under outcomes. We think about 25 pence in every pound that is spent on this goes straight back to the government, principally VAT, but also corporation tax, income tax, national insurance, through the huge number of jobs that are created doing this work. I've kind of talked to this. This is the stuff you would actually do. And there's a real opportunity to co-design this with communities and actually give agency to communities to drive this change at a collective level. We're talking about creating just to be really clear on the numbers here, we're talking about creating a vehicle alongside local government that designs and delivers this at zero cost to anyone living in the property. Now, nothing comes free, so we're also talking about effectively sharing the energy saving between the resident and the funding vehicle. So we're using 40 years of energy savings to part fund this. That means there has to be there's a legal contract that has to create, that has to succeed, successor in title, it has to be property linked, not individual linked, but all of that is technically possible. And that creates an income stream that allows us to raise that finance. Not going to go into these numbers, obviously, but this is just making the point. We think there's this 20% saving at least of doing this at scale through system design economies, delivery economies, and purchase economies. This is an energy bill. So somewhat scarily, average UK energy bill 2024, we think will be just over £4,000. It was 1,200 12, 15 months ago. The orange bars are what happens from those three components to your energy bill. And there, you can see the reason we've got solar storage in there, because it's the biggest reduction, even though it's the smallest amount of cost, just because electricity is so expensive. And then what we're showing on the right is the residual bill for the resident, the fee they might pay on top of that, but the saving they might take. So this is about taking a significant saving on where we are today. Now, there is clearly a policy decision about how big the resident share is and how big the funding share is. If you make the grey bit smaller and the yellow bit bigger, you put more money in people's pockets, you do more against fuel poverty, but you'll require more public subsidy to fund the model, and vice versa. You can move that around. And I would argue that should look different in different places depending on the affordability of that population. This is the super complicated version of the funding stack, but the one thing I wanted to bring in is the ability to bring in community investment. So there's an organization, a number of organizations doing this, but there's an organization called Abundance who are working with local government to create community bonds. So as a community, you can invest as little as £5 in investing in this product. And while that's not going to be, it's not going to pay for it, there'll be a small component. Again, it can build that sense of ownership and community ownership of those assets. I'll finish with this, just kind of 5 reasons why, most of which I've kind of touched on. I'm actually going to add a 6th, which I think is sort of sits beneath it, which is this model gives agency to communities and to local government in particular to actually drive this change. We talk a lot to local government. A lot of local governments have declared a climate emergency. They need to get to net zero by 2030, 2035, 2038, whatever date they have set. They own typically 0 to 5% of the built environment in their geography, yet they have to decarbonize all of it. And there's nothing they can do about that. This gives them something to do. But more than that, it gives communities agency to do something about it. And I think one of the potential benefits in my kind of more optimistic moments is that the other thing this may do, by creating a mechanism for communities to come together and co-design how they decarbonize where they live, and regenerate where they live, it will also be a catalyst to create community, actually. And you can, one of the key benefits of this is actually building much greater sense of community, particularly in our urban centers. I will stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. This is quite a deep analysis of the economics there. We'll return to that as well. Last but not least, Eleni Polychroniadou is an impact entrepreneur and on a mission to grow the green building market globally. As the co-founder of Sintali, an environmental verification company, Eleni takes a systems approach to decarbonizing the built environment. She works with the private sector, financial institutions, construction professionals, and governments to accelerate the uptake of green buildings in over 75 countries. Eleni was recently recognized as a rising star in ESG by the Women of the Future. And outside of her work, Eleni acted as the co-curator of the London Global Shapers Hub, where she led a team of 44 volunteers. She's also a trained climate reality leader, delivering trainings on climate change and lobbying local government to adopt more stringent environmental policies. Eleni, welcome. The floor is yours.
I'm going to test this. Okay, that sounds good. Hopefully you can all hear me. It's a pleasure to be here today. We've heard some really big challenges and really understanding the impact of the energy transition on climate change, which pretty much accounts for 75% of global greenhouse gas emissions, if you include that pretty much everything requires energy to operate. It's a bit scary. I work in the sector and I still sit in this room and feel completely overwhelmed by what we face in front of us. I could talk about buildings, but I think Rufus did a fantastic job on this. So today, I actually want to talk about something a little bit more personal, which is what's our role in all of this? Because as we sit and listen about retrofit and about hydrogen and about fossil fuels and new gas plants, there's a question that comes to mind, which is, can we actually do anything about this? Or is the scale of the problem so big that it's outside of our control? And I'm here to tell you that, yes, we can actually do something. And the power that each and every one of us in this very room is a lot bigger than what you might think is possible. Now, something you have to know about me, and I think Rufus mentioned before, optimism. I'm a stubborn optimist. I get asked a lot by my friends, my colleagues, by my parents, why do you bother? Why are you spending your time on this when nothing's going to change? When the data that Erik was showing us earlier with the carbon budget doesn't look great, and we don't feel like anything is happening in COP27 or nothing is really moving. It turns out stubborn optimism is a very good trait to have when you're a climate activist or a sustainability professional or anybody really in this room who is passionate and interested in trying to make a difference. I never anticipated in my life that I would actually work in sustainability. At 16, I actually wanted to be an actress, and then a marine biologist, and then a lawyer, and then a politician. And now I have co-founded an organization that looks at the environmental impact of buildings, which in human speak pretty much means that when companies claim that they have green buildings or sustainable buildings, we act as an independent party and actually check that they're telling the truth and that those buildings really are reducing the environmental impact. Not quite what my 16-year-old self might have anticipated for a career, but a series of life choices led me here. And it's always easy in retrospect to say and weave a picture that everything makes sense, but reality isn't quite so homogenous, and our choices sometimes don't make sense at the time. They are more snapshots, bumps, maybe a few U-turns. But perhaps the direction of where we're going in our life tends to be more cohesive, even if we can't see it at the time. I didn't plan to have a career in sustainability, but all I wanted to do was do something good and try and make some kind of positive impact on the planet. In university, I actually ended up studying environmental policy because environment seemed like a good lens through which to understand many humanitarian and social justice issues, which we've heard a lot about today. My first job was in public relations, which I had no idea what that meant, but it was public relations for clean technology companies, which felt like a good area to try and understand the energy transition. I also worked in a sustainability consultancy firm because I wanted to understand corporate sustainability strategy. But even when taking jobs within the sustainability sector, I still felt disconnected. I still didn't understand what my impact actually was and if I was really making a difference. And so my nightlife turned into what I call my climate activism life. And I ended up joining Climate Reality, organizing rallies. I joined Extinction Rebellion. I blocked some roads, which made me very uncomfortable, but I did it. I started a website called Climate 4, which was trying to translate climate science into human speak, as I like to say, and try to understand what are the tangible climate actions. I joined Global Shapers. And then in 2020, I started a company. And I started a company with a clear mission to make change and do something good. And it's taken me all over the world. I was just in Bolivia attempting to do these kinds of speeches in Spanish, which is a lot harder than it sounds. And we've really been focused on making change. Now, we're just a startup. We're a little bit over 2 years old, and we have projects in 75 countries looking at the impact of buildings. And in the last financial year, so our year runs July to June, we've helped reduce over 275,000 tons of carbon emissions every year, which again, if we put that into human speak, that's pretty much all of the electricity that homes use in the entirety of Lancaster, population around 50,000 and something. Now, I don't show you this to put numbers or to pat myself on the back, but to really show what 7 people have done, because that is the size of our company. We are 7 people. There's a lot more people in this room than my company. Think about the impact that we can all actually make. One of the interesting things about change is that we often enter a vicious cycle of blame. Governments set ambitious net zero commitments, not calling anybody out, UK, but then do things that go against it because they say business isn't ready, because business isn't doing enough things and the government doesn't want to create bad market conditions. Business, in the meantime, says, well, we'd love to do something, but the consumer demand isn't there. So we can't create products or make changes if people aren't ready to uptake it. And also, the government isn't giving us enough incentives and the financing isn't there, so we're not getting the money to do it. The financiers are saying, well, we want to finance these projects, but government isn't sending a strong enough signal to give us confidence that this is the direction that we're going in. And there's also not enough projects to finance. And us mere mortals, the individuals, we're looking at the other 3, wondering when they're going to get it together and actually do something about the change. And that's a problem, because this level of blame and this cycle causes paralysis. We're all looking at each other, wondering who's going to make a change and who's going to solve this energy transition crisis. And actually, the answer is in this very room. It's all of us who can break that cycle. It's all of us who can actually make a difference. Because what we often forget when we're thinking about big words like investors and government and business is that individuals are in each of these organizations. And it's ultimately individuals who are driving the energy transition forward, not these facades of what we call the government and the corporation. Now, let me make that a little bit more tangible. When we talk about change, when we talk about individual action, one way to easily help visualize this are these concentric circles. Now, the first circle is a circle of control. This is everything that's in your power to do. It could be switching off the lights, recycling. It could be choosing to eat less meat. Then there's the second circle, which is the circle of influence. Now, the circle of influence are things that you directly may not control, but you have some say in. For example, you may not be a CEO of a company, so you can't make the ultimate decision, but you're an employee in a company and you have a voice. You're a stakeholder who can actually influence the direction of an organization. And finally, we have the circle of concern. These are the things that are outside of our control and outside of our influence. So for example, I might be very concerned by the rising sea levels, but that's so far outside of my direct influence and control that it goes into the circle of concern. Now, as individuals, within the climate crisis, we've always been told to focus on our circle of control. We've been told, do your bit for the planet, recycle, eat less meat, don't fly. And that's important, but that isn't where our biggest power is. Our biggest power is the circle of influence. It's our ability to play a role in the broader ecosystem because we are all part of the same world and we all operate in the same society. And if we want to have systemic change, that has to mean we operate within the system and change the system within our level of influence. I'll give you a couple of examples. I joined Extinction Rebellion, I stopped some traffic, it made me very uncomfortable. So what I ended up doing was working with a few other Extinction Rebellioners, I think that's the right term, and we formed a lobbying group and lobbied our local council and ended up helping the council declare a climate emergency, which we then realized had no teeth. Because what we saw a year later was actually a piece of policy that came out on housing that had no mention of environment, sustainability, energy efficiency, or anything related to the climate emergency declaration and the net zero commitment by 2040 they made. And so we formed a group within the community, put together a 60-page research document highlighting all the reasons why sustainability in housing is absolutely critical, and lobbied our councillors and our local officers to ultimately change the policy. And we got it done. And that was nothing in our level of control. That was our circle of influence. But using our ability as active citizens, we were able to set a piece of policy that is now holding them accountable to make sure that any future developments happening in our borough are actually taking into account and incorporating key energy efficiency and sustainability measures. Another example of a circle of influence is your role within an organization. So before starting a company, I actually worked as an employee in a sustainability consultancy. And when I started, I realized the sustainability consultancy company didn't have an internal sustainability strategy, which blew my mind. And I ended up requesting a meeting with the CEO and asking him to really push forward the sustainability agenda. And like with every business, the answer was, how much is it going to cost me? What's the benefit? I need a business case. Okay, so again, rally the troops, get together a plan, put numbers on it, make it clear, make it tangible. And actually we lobbied internally and ended up changing again the direction of the organization and implementing a tangible plan. Now, I wasn't an important stakeholder. I was a junior employee and my colleagues were also junior, but we had a voice and we were able to actually make a difference simply by exercising our circle of influence. Even today in my organization, my circle of control is tiny. I have a company of 7 people. We don't have offices. I can make good purchasing decisions and help buy, say, products, laptops that have a low environmental footprint. But my circle of influence is where my power lies. So I'm talking to major banks to try and get more financing, to try and get more private capital into the sector. I can't control what happens in those organizations, but I can influence those conversations. I can really expand that circle. And even if 1/10 of the people that I engage with and work with take and make better decisions, then my impact is tenfold what it could be if I focus on my center of control. The energy transition isn't about fossil fuel companies. It isn't about large corporates. It's about all of us. We're all in this world and we all have a role to play. Whether you're an activist, whether you have a job in sustainability or not, each and every one of us have incredible power to really drive change and really drive the energy transition forward. So we know we can't depend on government. We know we can't depend on corporates, but we can depend on ourselves. And understanding how to use our power and using it wisely is the best solution we have to actually make this a reality. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Eleni. A necessary dosage of optimism, especially in the week where when the Secretary General of the UN said, we are on a highway to climate hell and the foot on the accelerator. We can call that optimism, but anyway. Here's a question to all of you. Fantastic insights. But the energy transition arguably has had a couple of false starts, right? So we had the pandemic and everyone was saying, well, we're going to build back better. We saw what the emission reductions look like. We're going to do it better after we restart the economy. And then the Russian invasion of Ukraine happened. Europe has gone back to using gas. There's coal-fired plants that are coming online across Europe. That has created complications between Europe and continents like Africa that say, well, that's kind of hypocritical, isn't it? You tell us we need to transition to renewables, but suddenly with the first crisis, you're going back to fossil fuels. Yet the IEA this week, the International Energy Agency, said that actually the war in Ukraine has accelerated or is expected to accelerate the transition to renewables. Is that another false start, or do you guys feel that this time is for real?
I can have a go at that. I think it's all about narrative. It could be either of those things. And it's about the narrative that we allow legislators to adopt. So we can talk about energy efficiency in terms of carbon, tons avoided. But if we talk about it in terms of jobs created, if we talk about it in terms of healthcare benefits, if we talk about it in terms of community creation, if we talk about it in terms of the leveling up agenda, if we talk about it in terms of fuel poverty, there are all of these things are interlinked. And energy security is not a reason to burn more coal. It's a reason to make buildings more energy efficient. And we need to collectively enforce that view upon our, my words carefully, on the people who make these decisions.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I think it's a narrative. I'm not too sure about the multiple false starts because I'm not quite sure whether anything has started yet. But the Ukraine invasion, to me, when that happened, I thought two things. First of all, yes, this is good for the transition or the transformation, because in principle, if you cut fossil fuels out of the system, by far the cheapest and the quickest way to recover from that is to burn less and to switch to renewables, because nothing has a bigger energy security than energy that you create in your own place. And renewables does that. So that is pretty much a no-brainer. And the other thought you have is that we have in the field some really big public relations experts, and they're experts in what Naomi Klein calls disaster capitalism. Whenever any upset happens, you try to turn it into your own personal benefit. And that is exactly what the oil companies did and what the coal companies did, and helped by the governments who were surprised and didn't know where to go. And they listened to their first advisors. And of course, the oil companies, their lobbyists are second to none in capabilities. They're incredibly good and efficient and powerful and well-funded. And they are the first ones to knock on the door and say, oh, we have the solution. To which the government say, oh, that's great. But of course, it isn't the solution. And that's why I think the narrative is the direct impact. If you want to get rid of dependence on Russian gas, which is the narrative, if you want to do that, then you use less gas. That's really simple. You don't need to burn more coal. You just use less gas. And there are lots of opportunities which are ready to be taken, and governments everywhere have refused to take, either because they're too complicated or because there are no big handouts related to this. And that's to do, it's much easier to deal with a few big wealthy companies who will do something for you with a lot of money than it is to deal with retrofit providers, for instance, because you're dealing in a company like the UK, you're dealing with 40 or 50,000 companies that you can't speak to.
I think both panelists kind of covered it, but it's it's interesting to think about the energy independence has always been associated with fossil fuels. There's been very few communications out there that renewable energy gives you energy independence, which of course it does, to your point. And I think it's been really interesting to see this opening suddenly a lot of countries that had committed to not exploring any new fossil fuel reserves, suddenly using Ukraine as an excuse to change policy and to start looking at things that actually go against legislation, like in the UK. But ultimately, we know that if we want to create resilient communities to such large political shocks, we need localized, decentralized energy systems. We need more community energy. We need smaller infrastructure that actually enables these communities to thrive. And it's so many vested interests play into the energy transition. And it is frustrating from our side to see where big money and big lobbying power can really completely shift legislation. But I would say this is also where it's super important to tie into the fact that for resilient communities, for the future, we all engage with a government to really make sure that policy is sticking to it, and also recognize that things like the cost of living crisis, the cost of energy can be addressed through sustainable solutions, because there's the other narrative that we have to remember, which is green is expensive. And that perpetrates everywhere. I work with companies around the world, and every single person is green buildings are expensive, renewables are expensive, that's a luxury good, that's something for wealthy, expensive opportunities. It's not something for the masses. And until we can change that and tie those things together, I don't know if we can really drive it forward.
Great. I thought you were going to be the optimist, Eleni, but okay. So here's the thing. You mentioned vested interest, and it's interesting because we are going through a period where we see oil and gas companies having unprecedented profits, right? For some people, that feels like the last gasp of the industry wealth, whereas for others, it seems like refueling, pun intended, for an even longer, bigger, nasty fight against renewables and slowing down the transition to renewables, right? But on the other hand, you do see countervailing forces. For instance, look at the elections in the US this week, right? The red wave that never happened was essentially stopped by Gen Zs that actually voted on important issues, one of which, of course, arguably the most important was climate policy, abortion rights, and so on and so forth. So what more do we need to do to win this fight? What more do we need to do to invest those interests, if you like, and really hit the accelerator on the transition to renewables? And embedded in that question, let me just be more specific, right? People say that, we might be switching our supply to gas right now, or local gas and so on, to avoid to not buy Russian gas. But at the same time, we're building infrastructure that might lock in future emissions and actually delay the transition. So that means we're not dealing with gas as a bridge fuel, but rather that's kind of only the surface, right? Because once we build these assets, we've been locked in. So how do we win the fight, and how do we get away from being stuck on gas, essentially?
I mean, the other example other than the US is Australia, right? Where the right-wing party effectively split out. Actually, it wasn't Gen Z there. It was typically Gen X. Is that me? I guess that is.
I lost track. I'm too old for this.
40, it was principally 40 to 50-year-old women in Australia who were right-leaning voters who broke away and created a new party, stood as independents and took down the government. And that has led to a change. Now, I'm not trying to take a party political view there, because I don't think any political party currently has a clear plan around delivering this. But I think it is political lobbying and street fighting, essentially, to change those narratives, because the vested interests, as Erik said, are incredibly well organized. To give you another example, if you speak to any politician about energy efficiency and homes, they will immediately talk about, oh, and yes, there's the potential for hydrogen. Right? As Erik alluded to earlier, the laws of thermodynamics mean that that is not the answer. Every kilowatt hour of renewable energy that you use to run a heat pump, you get 3 to 3.5 kilowatt hours of heat out of it. Every kilowatt hour that you use to electrolyze, to create hydrogen, transport that hydrogen to a home, and then burn it in a boiler, you get about 0.4, 0.5 roughly. It's incredibly inefficient. Yet, if you happen to own a large gas network in the UK and we switch to heat pumps, you've got a stranded asset that's worth nothing. If we switch to hydrogen as the source of heating our homes, you've suddenly got a valuable asset. They're incredibly well mobilized. Every politician I've spoken to has been hit by that lobbying group, and we need to be countering that and change. Again, it's about the narrative.
I have to say that I sometimes struggle with my optimism, and I've been at this game for a while. And I got some optimism of Liz Truss's short stint as Prime Minister, because I thought every time she opens her mouth, she brings the revolution one day closer. And that would solve the problem. When she left and Sunak took over, I thought, okay, I was waiting for Sunak to open his mouth and do the same, and he's duly done that. But seriously, I mean, I'm hoping that we get this transformation before the revolution steps in, because that's always going to be messy. I think what is really important is for individuals to step up. And I've noticed the impact of opening. I mean, I've always been an outspoken person. The reason I know that most of the people who I've worked with in the oil industry are actually concerned about climate change and concerned about doing something. And I accidentally found out that quite a large number of my former colleagues are still consulting, but are not consulting, refuse to work for oil industry anymore. And those conversations happen. I only found that out by opening conversations and opening the conversations, finding out that other people are also concerned, but afraid to talk about this. And once you get that happening, and then the next step is to actually get people to do something. And yeah, that's really so important, to do whatever you can. And it's not a joke anymore. This is a really serious emergency. And it's a far greater emergency than most people realize. And yet nothing is being done at the emergency level. Yeah, in an emergency level, as a government, you pull out all the stops. You actually, usually, you switch off democracy because you can make more effective decisions that way. Now, what's happening is that, yes, the governments are switching off democracy, but not to make more effective decisions, to stop effective decisions from being made. And that is also something which people need to stand up for and do something. That's really important.
I would say actually sometimes democracy is being used as a delaying tactic as well. So one of the things when lobbying with said local council that I was working with, saying, why aren't you including these in part of your policy? The feedback was, well, we want to be resident-led and we want our residents to ask for these things. And I said, great, are you educating your residents on this? Because we can't expect every single person to know what a heat pump is and how energy efficiency measures work and what are the different benefits of different measures. That's not fair. And it's a complete delaying tactic to really remove the level of responsibility. I think the only thing I would add to this conversation is the acknowledgement that it's going to take courage for us to make real change, because what we're looking at is a complete change of the current system. And it hasn't been done to the level that we need to do. And it's going to take a lot of power and willingness to make change. And that means that we can't expect other people and we can't expect people in power to take a leap of faith and just do it if they're not seeing the support. And it's true across the system. And I mentioned this. If you think about, again, the cycle of blame, if you think about the key players who can really change a market, the investors, the people who have the money to do it, the government who has the stick approach, so setting the regulation, the companies who have the power and the agility to be innovative and to change, and all of us. If all of those players aren't in agreement, genuinely in agreement, and that's not clear, no one's going to jump off a cliff, right? It really is hard. But all of those players and all of that system needs to be in alignment, clearly, publicly, I want to say unanimously, at least majority, to really drive it forward, because it is a huge crisis. It is an emergency. It's scary to see our own country changing. I mean, Summers are warm. We have sun. We have drought in the UK. What's that going to look like in 30 years? It's real and it's happening, but it is going to take courage.
Can I add one layer of optimism?
Sure, please do.
But,
I mean, summer in the UK wasn't a pessimistic view, but yeah, sure.
No, exactly. But I think, again, I'm going to keep saying the word narrative, but actually actions that support that narrative. Change is often brought out as a negative. If we change things, they can be better, right? Housing can be warm and not damp and not drafty. We can live in places with more green infrastructure in our urban cities. The connectivity between mental health and living within 50 meters of a group of trees has been proven. I mean, there's so much benefit from doing this. And that's the narrative. We need to move away from a narrative it's going to cost so much money, it's going to be so disruptive, to one of we can really transform where we live. And I think that could be a really optimistic narrative.
Great. So time is vicious when you have so much deep knowledge and expertise on a panel. So I could ask about 342 more questions, but I'm going to ask one last more technical question, because I think that might perhaps be on people's mind, especially in the audience here, a bit of a controversial perhaps issue when we talk about the energy transition. And that's the issue of, is nuclear part of the answer, right? Or more, are we only talking about wind, solar, geothermal, and so on? And as I'm sure all of you know, this was a big discussion when the European Union was deciding whether or not to classify nuclear as a green source of energy, or a renewable source of green, rather, not renewable. So just wanted to finish with that. Perhaps you could explain to our audience, first of all, why is that even controversial on nuclear? What is the controversy? And feel free to share your own view if you consider that to be part of the equation or part of the transition. Erik, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll start on that. And you'll have noticed on my slides that I left the nuclear block in the sources the same size, because that conversation has too small an impact to be taken along. And to come back to the narrative, if you look at the conversation, several prime ministers ago, Boris, do you remember him? And he had his 10-point plan, which had nuclear expansion. We cannot build nuclear power stations in the time required to solve the problem. So that is not a solution to the problem. Whether nuclear in the long run has any value, considering its limitations, that's a different story, but it will only cover a very small amount. I'm personally not an advocate of nuclear, and I've been aware of the risks since I was at university in the 1980s. But it's not important now, it's just that it's another one of these really big lobbying groups. And that's why they ended up in Boris's plan. There's absolutely no benefit from a climate perspective of building 10 nuclear power stations when we've proven that the ones that we're trying to build here we've not managed to build within 25 years because they have mistakes and they have to be rebuilt and everything else. That's just not possible.
Twice the budget.
At twice the budget. There's lots of issues with nuclear which doesn't make them a problem. If you would invest the same amount of money elsewhere, you would get much more benefit. And that is separate. There's one thing about nuclear which it is now, and which is why Boris was talking about, and lots of advocates for nuclear are talking about these small modular reactors, which, by the way, don't exist apart from in literally a handful of submarines. There's very clear evidence that these cannot be manufactured safely at scale. Additionally, they don't exist. So why would we bet on something that's not going to do anything better than what we already have, that's going to be a higher risk, and we don't know if we can ever build it? And that conversation has been going on. There's conversations government level about fusion. Yep. Those are the exact same conversations which were going on at government level in 1981 when I went to the university. Exactly the same level of detail. And we've learned so much about fusion. We've learned, and we still know, we knew then, fusion on Earth requires a temperature which is, I think, 100,000 million times higher than that on the sun because of gravity. There's nothing you can do about that. So we're trying to make something which we cannot do on a lab scale yet. And we're saying, oh, well, in 5 or 10 years, we'll have the answer. No, in 50 years, if we can do it on a lab scale, it'll be interesting for a physicist. But none of this has any value.
And I think it kind of ties into maybe a point that you made earlier, Erik, around needing the way that we're looking at energy and the systems is all still very centralized, and carbon capture storage is a way of allowing fossil fuel companies to continue doing what they're doing. Nuclear, in a way, is also allowing us to still think about the energy system in the same way, where it's one source, a lot of energy being pumped out and sort of sent out in a centralized way. Whereas when we look at renewables, we are looking at a slightly different distribution model. We're looking at a different generation model. We're looking at it in a different way, which, to Rufus's point, change is not bad. And actually thinking about something in a different way is not a negative thing. But I think nuclear kind of, to me, at least, sits in that similar bucket of how can we try and solve a problem without changing very much and try and kind of do a like for like, an apple for an apple, when maybe the answer is, let's look at an orange and a banana and a pear and actually look at that combination, and that's going to help us do something differently.
Kind of one thing to that, I think one of the arguments that often gets rolled out for nuclear, and I'm not an engineer, is baseload. So you get your renewable energy when it's sunny or when it's windy. That's not necessarily when we all put on the kettle to make a cup of tea at halftime and in the World Cup or whatever. Not that I'll be watching this World Cup. And therefore you need that base load so that we've always got the lights on effectively. Now, I think the answer to that is storage, not nuclear. And so if we had distributed, if every house had a battery, and then you roll out EVs, which are then also connected to the grid, you've got huge flexibility in your network. So when it's windy, you load up everyone's batteries and then you use it over time. So I think that argument can be debunked with storage. Mm-hmm. But as Erik said, the biggest thing is it just takes decades. Let's stop spending money on that now and spend money on insulation.
Just one point on baseload. When you learn to design renewable energy systems, the first thing you learn is in a renewable energy system, there is no use for baseload. Because by definition, a renewable energy system has its peaks. You design it for the peaks. When you create baseload, and nuclear plants are notoriously slow to respond and to turn down and up, they will still be producing when you have lots of renewable energy. So you're using something you cannot switch off to cover the bits when you don't have anything. That's exactly where you can do that with storage, and you don't have to look at battery storage. You can look at heat storage. We're using most of our energy as heat, and heat storage is far, far cheaper than electricity storage. And you can do it distributedly quite easily.
Wonderful. Eleni, Erik, Rufus, we ran out of time 10 minutes ago. So audience, please join me in thanking our very esteemed speakers for sharing their insight. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you.